Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to Textiles and Tea with the Handweavers Guild of America. I am Daryl Lancaster. Kathy's not able to be with us today, so I get to play host. Our sponsor today is Tabby Tree Weaver. Tabby Tree is a one-stop fiber shopping a store in Fishers, Indiana. They have yarn and classes and kits, weaving and spinning, books, magazines, and general fiber art supplies, and they sell used equipment. We welcome your questions, and we'll try to address as many as we can at the end of the program. Please put your questions in the Q&A. Feel free to contribute to the chat, talk to each other amongst yourselves, but we don't see the questions in the chat. We need to see them in the Q&A. And today we are having tea with Al Canner. Al began creating macrame works, both wall hanging and sculptural, in the 1970s. Since his retirement from professional pursuits in 2013, he has devoted much of his energy to knotting, usually producing 5 or 6 works each year. His pieces have been shown in local, national, and international juried exhibits. Some of his works incorporate found objects. Many are inspired by nature. Color plays a central role in all the pieces, which commonly combine fiber made of cotton, hemp, jute, and rattail. Rather than rely on an infrastructure for support or shape, his pieces depend solely on the robust strength of the knots themselves, almost always the humble double half-hitch. He's completely self-taught, and he has developed techniques for achieving the results that he intends while regularly surrendering to the instruction offered by the cords passing through his hands. Welcome, Al, to Textiles and Tea.
Thank you.
And of course, this is Textiles and Tea. So what is your favorite tea?
Well, I'm a black English breakfast tea guy. And when I can get it, Marks and Spencer Extra Strong, and otherwise Taylor's.
Taylors?
Lors.
Lors, okay. Very cool. I don't think we get that here in the East. So, Al, everybody wants to know, how did you get started in fiber?
Well, I was a hippie back in the 70s and moved from the East Coast to about 73 here to Colorado. And there's loads of sun and great growing for plants, and we needed plant hangers. So I had seen, as everyone had back in the 70s, the raw jute plant hangers. And I actually don't have a clear memory of this, but I think just by looking at some, I figured out how to do the double half hitch. And I started a little life of making these raw jute plant hangers, which filled our house. And then by some luck, I came, and I'll mention more of this probably later, but I came into a large stash of all sorts of different colored and gauge and feeling of cord and twine, and just an amazing batch. And that really stimulated me. And I started sort of moving a little bit into wall hanging life after producing some much more colorful than usual plant hangers. And I at some point in the early 80s, I had 6 relatively good. I don't have a clear memory of them, and I only have a picture of 1 or 2 of them now, but I had 6 pretty good pieces, and they got on consignment into a weaving shop here in Boulder. And within a couple of months, the store burned down. and all my pieces were lost. And it was a great setback. And it coincided just as I was plunging into what would be decades of professional work. And I just sort of put it all aside and really didn't return to it until in my young 50s, when I had taken a year off in between careers. and rediscovered this stash of incredible cord I had, and started what I refer to as the modern era of my work. And while I was still working, which was about another 8 years at that time, I was producing about one work a year. And now in retirement, at least the first 8 years of it, I was producing about 5 or 6 a year.
So, okay, so a full confession here. When I graduated from art school in the 70s, my first job out of art school was to teach jute, macrame, plant hangers in a mall craft shop. So I am really familiar with the medium, but what I cannot wrap my head around is how you saw such possibilities in that lowly single hitch, and it became this incredible creative avenue for you back then, and then even now in your retirement years. Can you talk about that? And we have, I think, a slide that shows very specifically what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think the other
slide
one
doesn't quite
shows the half hitch, the other side that goes with this, I think.
Yeah, there's Mandy, we got a little glitch here because this isn't showing the full thing that we're supposed to see. There is a small slide, should be a small slide of the actual half hitch. But yeah, so if you could just talk about what you saw in that knot and then how that became your work.
Well, I mean, there shouldn't be any assumption that I did it as an educated choice because I didn't. I started with the double half hitch in whatever manner, as I said, I can't remember, that I stumbled upon it. I didn't even for years know its name. I just knew this was the knot I was doing to produce this work. And the double half hitch really lends itself to the type of work I was doing. The type of macrame I do, the knotting I do, actually has a name, which I only learned some 6 or so years ago, which is called cavandoli, named after an Italian teacher in the early 1900s who wanted the kids to develop fine motor skills and knew this technique and taught her children this. And then they went out and sold their little works. And the thing that was so pronounced about their work and is such a feature of cavandoli is you can switch just perfectly cleanly in a single knot from the warp to the weft and vice versa. So that opens the world to incredible sharp color changes of all sorts. So right away, when I was into that sense of the color, I realized this was a great knot for me. And then another feature of the cavandoli, which, as I said, I didn't realize I was moving into at the time, it's often referred to as tapestry-like. And now I understand in a way I didn't at first when I was hearing that term, that it's weft dominant. You see the weft and the warp unless you move it into a weft roll is just not seen at all. It's around which the knot is formed.
It's the core. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's that's what I was developing and moving into, and so that was the right knot for it. And then it also, and this to some degree is true, of course, of many knots, but the traditional non-cavandoli type of macrame often has a lot of open area that sort of forms into diamond shapes and are, founded upon the knots at each of the points, but there's openings and so on. In the cavandoli technique, it's solid, as you'll see in all my work. And the strength of those knots, the hundreds and hundreds of knots backed up against each other, and then in course after course, it is so strong that I quickly started learning, and this is a big part of my practice now in this, is that I could form all sorts of bulges and shapes and indentations and sharp turns. And after a few courses around it, they were there forever. There was no changing that shape once they were knotted in. So what I came to know over time, and for me, it's just the double half hitch is what sings this out to me, is the power of this knot. And very early on, maybe earlier than it was warranted, the trust I've always had in the double half hitch, allowing me to reach the ends I have in mind.
Oh, wow, that is a great explanation. And yeah, thank you for that. So you were a professor of law before you became a full-time artist. Typically, we get guests on Textiles and Tea that have either a science background or a math background, but you were a professor of law. These two careers appear to be so different, but is there a common ground between the two?
Well, let me start by answering by saying it's the very difference between the two, which is what has served me so well. Before being a law prof, I had a succession of very cerebral left brain, if that's still in vogue, types of work. And I remember during the years when I got back into this, which was coincided with the 8 years I was teaching at the law school here in Colorado at Boulder, sometimes one of the things I taught was legal writing, and it necessitated grading. So I sometimes would be home for multiple days, just from morning until evening, just doing this incredibly intense thing. And then if I had time to do it, I would move out into another room and pick up my macrame board, and I could almost feel the switch in my brain from the left to the right side. So that difference, as well as, and in some way it explains my sort of completely self-taught, uneducated, unseeking sort of way that I plowed into this. That's also such a difference for me. So much of certainly my professional life was so carefully orchestrated internally in my head, and so much preparation, so much reading, so much understanding at all points of it in a very, cognitive way, that allowing myself the freedom, which I indeed, almost liberation, have experienced in my life, and now in blissful retirement, getting to just not and not and not. So now there might be one range of similarity, at least for me, and that is the sort of compulsive precision of law. My wife would call this being anal. And for me, in the type of work I do with the repetitive knot for hours and hours, it has that same sort of each knot being a work of perfection. At least that's my intent. And I usually am quite intentful as I'm knotting and around each knot.
And that makes sense. And actually, I just saw in the chat pop up somebody else is a law professor and was very thrilled with that background. Yeah.
Retire from the law.
You heard it here.
Fiber full time.
Your works have so much movement, from the shapes of your 3D works and the use of color to create direction and flow. There are I just have to, so this popped up again. She said she's going to tell her boss that you told her to leave. Okay, so back to the question. Your works have so much movement, from the shapes of your 3D works and the use of color to create direction and flow. These two works are great examples of this. Where does this energy come from?
Well, to a large part, for me, it comes from the material, from the cord itself. I'll tell that story now. I just suggested a moment ago. In the late 70s, early 80s, when I was first getting into this and still was using raw jute, it was a sort of a sad time in America where all the ubiquitous small and large town hobby shops were disappearing. They were all family owned, and they were going down and being replaced with the national chains. And I lucked upon it at that time. I think on 3 different occasions, my wife and I were either in Boulder or some nearby smaller towns, and out on the sidewalks or otherwise happening were going out of business sales. So in a very short period of time, maybe within like a year, I suddenly had a trunk full of at least 100, maybe well more, spools of cord and twine and, everything one could imagine of every possible material, an unbelievable palette of colors, and loads of different gauge widths, from 1 and less than 1 to 2.5, perhaps, maybe even larger. So the richness of that, in a way that I can't really explain and don't know why it occurred, but it just stimulated me in such a way. So that having such an amazing palette and stash of many things, really has been an inspiration for me. And then the other influence I'm sure I had that caused this to happen and serves still as an energy source for me in this is my wife, who is really a serious 2D, principally artist in drawing and painting and so on. And for all the many decades now we've been together, that's always been a major force. And I've both got to see the quality work and the beauty of what she was producing, but also got to witness the commitment to an art or a craft, or just deep in her body and something that she must do. And I didn't realize I was going to fall into that wonderful hole myself. But that has much to do with it. Now, these two that are of my pieces that are being shown right now, I think they are illustrative of what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. The one on the right, perhaps particularly, which I call Pyramids, and was my inspiration for it, though I didn't know the name of it at the time, is a quilt pattern called the half-square triangle. I was sort of thinking of log cabin, which is pretty much the only particular design I knew, though this isn't a log cabin. And after it was about halfway through and I was looking online, I realized, oh, this actually has a design name. But I knew when I planned this and started it that every one of the squares that form the pyramid sides, the matching side of the next bordering pyramid would be the same color. So that's true with a couple of modest exceptions, but pretty much throughout that there's always, it's almost creates this opening butterfly triangle. And then, as I did at first, not purposely, because I actually mounted these pyramid at a time, starting in the left-hand corner and sort of moved across it. So I early on, if you'll see on the upper left, starting in the first upper left and then moving into the one beneath it and then the one to the right of that, there ends up being a rectilinear form in the light blue. And that happens near to the right in pink. And so I hoped that something like that would happen. And that certainly allows the eye to move with the color. And then to my surprise, because I didn't know this was going to happen, maybe the best example of this is toward the upper right. You'll see sort of 1, 2, 3, 5 of them that have sort of a green triangle, all of which are meeting and sort of ends up forming a large diamond shape that goes into 4 of them. So a friend of mine whose opinion I respect very much, and I think this comment was sort of out of both sides of her mouth, she said, I've never seen a piece of art before that the eye could never find a place to rest. Now, I'm not sure if that was a compliment or not, but there is certainly in this piece decidedly.
No, I think it's pretty remarkable. The more, and I've seen this piece because obviously we rehearsed this and looked at and picked these slides, but it is the kind of piece which I adore in fiber artists, that you stare at it and each time you look, you see something completely different. And I am so impressed with these rectilinear shapes that you've created with a 3-dimensional form. So you have a 2-dimensional effect and a 3-dimensional effect. And I would love to see this in person where you can move around it and see how they change. Your works, such as the ones that are coming up shortly, reflect your life, your surroundings, your cultural and religious heritage, and they are personal statements in such a joyous and refreshing way. You also explore color and dimension and shape and form and surface and texture, combining different weights and textures of cord. Can you talk a bit about your vision?
Well, I'll try to. I haven't done a lot of reading. I don't have a lot of language other than my own internal language. And I guess if I had to quickly categorize what it's about for me, it's extremely experiential. I'm in a way that I'm not used to in the rest of my life and the way I operate through my hands, and then of course through my eyes, but really touching it, the tactile quality of it. And in many ways, I must say, it's not true when I keep saying how completely self-taught I am, because I really do mean the term that you read when you were introducing me, and I use a lot, that I'm almost in every piece multiple times instructed by the cord. I mean, that's who taught me was the cord. And I've gotten to the point of being extremely responsive to what the cord is trying to teach me. And I can catch very early that, I thought I was going in a vertical line, but no, this is heading off. And then I make the decision, and now I have enough of a skill base to make it happen, to either quelch it and make that go away and continue where I want it, or probably more commonly to surrender to it and have it take me. And maybe, I perhaps had a name and a concept for the piece. I might even, by the time I'm done, be in a very different place because of where the cord took me. And as I say, unlike in many other parts of my life, I love, in some ways, not having any control over that. And it's going to take me. But surely, as you suggested, and as those pieces showed, my Jewish background, I have sort of a bunch of pieces that sort of are my Judaica group, and quite a few that are natural public lands sort of influence. I've been hiking in Colorado. The one on the left is indicative of that. And the idea of capturing in my work some of the sort of monumental landscapes I've seen. And so the one on the left, which is called Unnatural Bridge, really trying to do bizarre things with perspective. I mean, this is an overhead view. When you're looking at it a little more at its level, it almost does look like a mountain backdrop behind it, even though the water so close to it in the front is of a very different size and dimension. And then the one on the right is one of my favorite pieces called 10 Yarmulkes, taken from the 10 Commandments idea. And those are 10 sort of yarmulke shapes. Actually, the one on the upper left, I actually wore for about a year as a yarmulke until I got the inspiration to make this piece. But, wow. I think for most people, and certainly those that are part of a religious faith, there's certain iconic imagery, the iconography of the religion, such as for Jews, the 10 Commandments, that several of my pieces have sort of manifest themselves.
Before Mandy takes the slide away, can you just give us a range of size? Because somebody's asking, like, they don't have a scale in mind. The yarmulke piece, do you have, like, how tall is that?
That's 45 inches, I think it is, or so 43 perhaps. It's so some good size, yeah. And about, I think, 18 inches, if I remember right, in width. Yeah, it's a piece of some merit in terms of its size, for sure.
Yeah, and all of your pieces are on the large scale, which sort of leads me into the next question. That I understand that when you retired from law, I mean, you talked about this initially, that you dove in for 6 hours a day, I think 6 days a week, to produce a large body of work. But that came at a physical price. Obviously, with the size and scale of these pieces, yeah. What's your work process now?
Well, I was really incredibly blessed. I didn't realize as it was happening and unfolding, but in the first 8 years of my now slightly over 10 years of retirement, I did work just about 6 hours, 6 days a week. And I was just thrilled and loved every second of it. And just as an aside, macrame is brutal on the body. I think every single knot that I do, I've sort of tabulated based on the break point of various sorts of cord I've had, that it's probably 18 pounds of pull pressure with every knot. So after 8 years, sort of suddenly, the body started responding. And I've had just a range of tendon things and CMC joint osteoarthritis, and that really has slowed me down. But in between these ventures, I think I'm doing about 3 to 4 hours a day. Again, just about every day of the week. And for me, that feels like so little, but I'm lucky and I'll take whatever I could get.
As we do. Yes. Ask me
Right.
about my broken shoulder and I'm still wanting to work. Right. So I heard you talk about and I completely identify with this. I heard when I heard you talk about how when you finish an artwork, there is a mourning period that you go through, the loss of that which consumed you. So you try to dive right into the next piece without stopping. I mean, yeah, I completely identify with this, but can you elaborate further? Like what goes through your head in you making that transition?
Well, I mean, as you and probably all of us who are involved in these sorts of fiber work know, you put so much time and energy into it. It's almost like birthing a new entity. And then suddenly, one day, just like that, it's over. And in some cases, it's gone. It's out of your house and out of your life. And it's all you have left is the photographs. And because I had experienced a couple of times that sense of being bereft. I did have gotten into sort of the habit, I guess it is, of toward the end, often like the last 20% or something of the piece I'm currently working on, I start really visualizing what the next piece is going to be, and I'm usually able to dive into it, as you said, right away. What we have on the screen right now is a piece of mine called Art Glass, and this is demonstrative of a common way that I move into my subsequent piece. If you look at the top of this, you'll see that it has this sort of curvaceous, rolling 5 points that came out of the beginning central point of it at the very top of the work. I hadn't expected this to happen. I was looking forward to getting a sort of coming up again, but I didn't know it was going to end up being ribbed like this in those 5 humps. And then I went for it and, was really pleased with it. But Mandy, if you'll give us the next slide, you'll see what often happens to me, which is that concept of what played out there, a sudden, revelation and discovery and technique and result, ends up then being the impetus for me as the maker for what's really the inspiration behind the next piece. Not always obvious to the viewer, but it is to me as the maker. So here, what had been so much smaller, this now is, I think, about 17 inches, I think, roughly in diameter. So the middle section is probably about 8 inches or something. And it somewhat larger indeed than the top of the art glass piece. But then I decided to echo it as I got further out. And actually the other 5, just as a result of geometry playing out, they're so much further apart from each other than the central 5. But, that idea of something that I just stumbled upon that really worked in the current piece, that then serves as the genesis for really the whole feeling of the next piece for myself.
Thanks. Thanks. That was a great explanation. And it was great to see those 2 pieces juxtaposed, because you can clearly see that it's like the curiosity, wait, what if I did this? And then you're off and running to a new piece. Yeah. Here are 2 of your works that use found objects. Are the choices made for these editions based on appearance, meaning, or both? Because you are a collector of stuff from your travels.
I am that. I mean, if I were forced, as I am, to answer that question, I would think that, at first it's the appearance. I mean, the reality is that many of the found objects that I, in the last decade, have incorporated into my work, I actually found 2 and 3 decades ago. Or as I'll talk about in a second, on the view on the left there, those soldiers are from my wife's childhood in the early 50s. So some are even, almost lifelong possessions. But so I walking in grasslands in Colorado and some land that I used to get to live on. I'd sometimes run across a lot of rusted stuff. Much of my found objects is rusted material. And from the earliest time of my macrame days, I would look at such things and say, whoa, this is really going to be wonderful sometime in a macrame. And then decades literally might go by, and I might look at it in my stash and start putting it on top of my desk and moving it about. And one piece that recently made it into one of my works I had on my desk for about 3 years, looking at it right in front of me. And it's often been, it started as its appearance, and then a meaning grew out of it as I was visualizing it at the point I was about to use it in a piece, and then it became part of the piece. But often, as in the piece on the right, it's simply in an abstract way. I mean, there's not something that this piece is supposed to be, unlike the one on the left, which is called Island Reconnaissance and had a year on the road with HGA's Small Expressions a few years back. And it's even in the shape of an island and has these wonderful soldiers, these cast iron 50s era soldiers in it. And then the larger brass pieces that you're seeing. Do we have another picture of this, Mandy, of the full? I forget if we have a full or just the detail. Just the detail?
Yeah, I don't think so, but I think
okay.
It's on your website. So
it is indeed. So these brass pieces I got in the early 70s at a secondhand store in Denver. They're 4-inch long brass paper fasteners. We more often, to the degree they're still around these days, they're about 1.5 inches long or something, and you stick them through the paper and bend them back. And I had them, there were 100 of them in the box. It was a glorious thing. And I knew one day it would be something. And then it became these sort of tropical palm tree type things.
So you heard it here, everyone. Al says, contribute to that stash because you never know.
Never know.
And you mentioned that this piece was in Small Expressions. Can you talk about your exhibition journey? It's quite remarkable. And what was your reaction the first few times that you were accepted into major exhibits?
Well, in a way that hasn't been true for me, I don't think, in other parts of my life. From the moment I started making, good pieces, I've had this real desire to get them seen. I just want them to be out there and other people looking at them. And there's nothing more fun than standing nearby and hearing people's responses to them. So early on, I think somebody told me with whom I was communicating online that one of the ways to get seen by museum curators was to get into, and of course, the more prestigious, the better, juried shows. And part of my desire to be seen has been sort of an aspiration for museum placement. So that sort of got me into looking at juried shows. And as soon as I retired, I think it must have been, maybe even before, I became a member of the Northern Colorado Weavers Guild. And they, for many years, decades, had a juried show, national show called Fiber Celebration. And some of my earliest rounds of getting into shows was in Fiber Celebration, and I got a 3rd place the first year. And I think actually you asked me about my response in my early years of getting into shows. I don't think there's ever been a change. Anytime I get into a show, I yell and am crazy and being thrilled, and that's never stopped. So that's exactly the same. And I've really gotten into the enjoyment of traveling when I can to the openings of shows, either the jurors' talks like HGA does, of course, or other places and other shows. And there's just something about that absolutely thrills me, being there and seeing my pieces up on the wall. And I do thank HGA, by the way, for the many opportunities they give to us who are making to show our pieces and have the thrill of being juried into a piece. It's really quite nice.
And I suppose I should ask this because I've been in Fiber Celebration many times. I missed that show. But I should ask this because it kind of, what was your response? It was joyous when you got in, but how'd you feel when you don't get in? I mean, that's so crushing to people. And I've had to, hold people's hand and pat them on the back when they don't get in. And, I mean, it's heart-wrenching. It's heartbreaking.
I think that has changed for me a little bit because in the earliest days, I was bummed. I spent, the rest of the day when I learned, just in the dark. And now, because I've entered so many shows, I'm quite experienced at getting rejected. And, the thing I didn't know when I started this, and maybe many of the listeners don't, I always assumed there'd be some panel of, prestigious people, and almost always it's a single juror. So that helped me realize, well, either this juror is going to think my stuff is something, or what's this? And so, of course, for jurors who appreciate my work, or as many have told me actually over these last decade when I've been getting into shows, that they looked at my work online, because that's, of course, how we enter these days, and they thought, what is this? I don't know what it is. And that has been what I reluctantly have discovered. I thought when I retired and had loads of time to be online and trying to find a group of macraméists, knotters, and what I learned instead is that there aren't actually some group of people doing the magnitude in terms of size and so on of work that I'm doing. There are a fair number of people doing much smaller, often women's jewelry, necklaces, and some of those are quite nice, but it's a much smaller scale than what I'm into. And so that's been sort of amazing to be out there on my own. But I recently was invited by the Handweavers Guild of Boulder, of which I'm now a member too, by their tapestry study group. They saw a presentation I did, and in a way I had at that moment had no idea. They told me how in many ways what I'm doing is more like the tapestry work they do than a lot of other type of weaving. And they invited me to join them, and I have now since last fall. So for the first time ever in my work as a knotter, I once a month get to meet with people who are not doing the same thing I'm doing, but are appreciating what I'm doing, and I'm learning what they're doing, and there are similarities indeed. And I get to bring it in progress each month. And so I'm really quite thrilled to have for the first time sort of a group of people that I can sort of talk about like what I'm doing with.
Yeah. Wow. So you're on this quest to get into a museum. Other than what's next for you?
Well, I'm, as I mentioned, a member now of a couple of guilds and the study group, and both the Handweavers Guild of Boulder guild-wide and my study group have challenges happening this year to create things with certain aspects to them. And I'm certainly going to do that. It sounds like fun to me to be involved with a group of people all with sort of somewhat of a similar concept working forward. I'm actually right now on the last weeks recovering from a broken wrist, slipping on the ice. I had no idea how much our hands worked together. And of course, I haven't been able to knot since the beginning of February when this happened, but I'm not too many weeks away. And it made me realize how much I hunger to do this. I was about 2 weeks into a new piece when I fell. So I've just been salivating to get back to it. And I'm sure I will do that soon. And I know I'm going to continue trying to enter juried shows.
Wow. Before we get to audience questions, one thing did pop up that I saw in the chat, and I'm sure there's going to be a million people asking this because, everybody always wants to know about, how it's done. But can you, with I mean, there's no visuals here, but can you just briefly describe, you know, like, do you start from the top? Do you start from the middle out? Do you start from both sides? Do you connect in, you know, like, because I don't think people use this, not the way you're describing in a regular way. Can you just kind of briefly give us a visual in your head? Because we don't have visuals here on the screen.
Right. Well, pretty early on, I realized that the most challenging aspects and what, at least for my eye, quickly shows sophistication or not in the finished work is the mounting and the ending. So I've put a lot of energy in my time in thinking of ways to start and that really work with the piece and become part of it, and are not, though sometimes this can work, but are not just the hanging down at the bottom by gravity loose end bottoms that we do from the 70s with the owls and so on. So I actually start in all sorts of ways. I always use, however, corkboard. An inch thick corkboard. I have a 20 by 20 and I have a 36 by 24, and not remarkably, my pieces are often 19 by 19 or 23 by 30, you know, because that's my space. I increasingly in my life start by using T-pins and pin down the perimeter of the form. So I have the actual completed outside shape. And then I, for days, mount on it, usually mounting it, not like I mentioned in the pyramid, but all, you know, the next step is mounting the entire piece. So I have to have a lot going on in my head by then, if it's a piece, as most of them are, that are only in my head before they start being created. And then it's really, for the pieces that start like that, it's sort of almost like a coiling process, where you literally, with the single warp cord, go around and around the form. And if you just do that, go around and around the form, you'll end up with walls that go straight up that exact same form. So in order to not just go straight up, but to actually control it and have it sort of turn back in, so you have a surface, you have to drop cord or add cord, depending on what's going on. And that is so much fun. And if your perimeter, as so many of mine are, is sort of curvaceous, it lends itself almost immediately to incredible, exciting bulges and indentations. And I now realize at certain points where, oh, I can absolutely control if I take a turn to the right here or bulge, or, you know. So as my skills have increased, it actually has become more and more challenging and fun. And I almost always, in pieces, as I'm, for example, in the type I mentioned to you where I mount the perimeter, I purposely build in parts where I know, oh boy, this is going to be hard. And I don't really know at that moment how I'm going to live through it and make it work, but I set it up for myself. And I've had the amazing luck in my trust that I have of the knot, that only once ever did I undo a piece I had started because it just wasn't going to do it. Every other time so far, I've been so lucky, have, you know, from inception until finish, and I've usually been at least modestly pleased with the result.
Well, I would be. I mean, it's an incredible body of work. And so I'm looking at some of the questions, and this takes off of what we just said, you know, because people want to know, do you make up your pattern? How do you create them? Is it on paper? I think I had heard you talk in a video where you talked about how sometimes they're drawn out, but depends.
And mostly, as I just mentioned, it's in my head. But the rainbow trout that was shown at the beginning, just as we were starting, because I didn't really know trouts and haven't been a fisher person, I spent a lot of time on that one as an example online, and figuring out, after I printed out some rainbow trouts, oh, the dorsal fin starts 40% back and it has to be 2/3 the size. So some of them, like that one in particular, or ones that are very geometric and I have straight lines and I know I have to start this weft 3 inches from that one. And those I might draw out first, but at least 75% of them, if not more, are just in my head.
Someone, let's see, I should mention the person's name. That first question was from Susan Nelson. Here's a question. to kind of give people a range, because you talked about having a huge variety of cords and textures and surfaces, what's the finest yarn thread rope that you've used, and what's the thickest? And that's from Karen LeBlanc.
Well, not counting the raw jute days and my more sophisticated work now. Probably the smallest I go is called 1 millimeter, but it more often, or at least some of the types, are probably 0.7 in truth. And then the largest I ever use or buy by that name, sometimes I'm sure they're a little bit larger, but it's 2. So I pretty much go from almost always 1 or 2 millimeter, often mix them together, which is a creator of amazing bulges and bizarre things. And sometimes I have some 1.5 that I use, but that's pretty much it for me.
But there's a very tight range there. Yeah. And to follow that, Donna C wants to know, what is cord that you use? Where do you find it? Are you still using your old stash from the clothes station? Yeah. I think I had heard you say that it's mostly gone, but
yeah, I think I've used all of that wonderful stash. But then what I've done in much more recent years, well, I've always gone to secondhand stores and usually find nothing. And then occasionally, something you just can't believe, and some wonderful thing. So that's been a little bit of a side source. I almost never find anything in stores anymore. Or if it is, they're selling it by the foot or something, and it would, cost me thousands of dollars. So online has been the answer. And at one point I was buying directly from an outfit in India. It took sometimes 3 months for the stuff to get to me, but the prices were breathtakingly low. And then the 3rd or 4th batch I got from them was so moldy and mildewy. That was the end of that. So even though much of the cord I use is from India or China, I think an original, making, I buy almost exclusively online from American companies. And I mostly, more often than not, I'm using 2 millimeter cotton. But I also use what still a term that's not in vogue anymore, rattail. It's sometimes now called satin. And it used to be made out of rayon, which is wood-based. In my early purchases, it was all wood-based rayon. Now it's polyester, petroleum-based. And it's either polyester or nylon, but they look almost identical. I must confess, the rayon had a quality in the knotting that was better than the nylon and the polyester. I used to be able to find 1.5 and 2 millimeter linen cord, which I love to use, and I have not been able to find it for years and years. And I occasionally use much finer than the raw, but still pretty rough jute, colored jute. But it makes such a mess, and God knows what goes on in my lungs.
Well, there's that
fiber.
Yeah, more mask wearing, right? And actually, Anne-Marie Miller says, and I can answer this because we've looked at these pieces carefully. Do I see bullet casings? And she was asking about that piece that was the scenery. Yes, they're bullet casings. And, this part of your found object, you found these, right?
They are. And I must say, even though I am not a gun guy, I have over the years collecting, no, it's not in this one.
No, not this one, Mandy. The one that has with the 10 yarmulkes, I think it comes with.
I think it was on that one.
Yeah.
Right. There we go. Mm-hmm. Yeah. As I've walked, you can't avoid walking in the West across grasslands or any land and finding casings. And even though I'm not into guns, I have really found that I love the form and their beauty, and have successfully, I hope, used them in a number of pieces.
Okay. Let's see. Someone's asking if you've ever created an outdoor sculptural piece. I don't think you didn't, but yeah, Karen LeBlanc. Yeah, she's lots of questions here. Have you ever created something outdoor? Is that a goal of yours?
It isn't, though. It's passed my mind a couple of times. Early on, when I was just getting into all this, I was off somewhere and living sort of outside. And there was some old rope that was really thick. I don't know what it was in millimeters, but in inches, it was probably an inch thick in gauge, and it was old and awful looking and not dyed in any color or anything. And I started a shape that was living outdoors, but never quite finished it. And it has passed through my mind before, but I would have to be using a different type of cord than I'm using. As so many of the listeners know, the direct sunlight, oh my God, it's the death of the pieces, and the color is so fugitive. So I'd have to be using something, consciously, and I'm sure then I'd be using something of a much greater gauge
that could survive outdoors for at least somewhat of a period of time. Yeah, there is a suggestion here that you should totally watch for something called the World of Threads 2024. It's a call for submissions in Toronto. It's an amazing exhibition. The call will be out next month. So watch for the World of Threads 2024 for submissions, which is an exhibition in Toronto. But anyway,
thank you.
Yeah. And so I thought I'd throw that out because I don't know if you'll get to see the list here.
Let me just add, Daryl, for people who might not know this and who might be interested in entering shows. I'm sure it's only one of several such services now, but there's something called CAFE, CAFE. It's free for the artist, and you build up your own portfolio, and you get to look, and if you become a member, which is free as an artist, you get every week or 2 weeks a big list through your email of all the calls of entry that have hooked up with CAFE, and it's really a broad number of places and a great way to enter and find out who's asking for entries.
There's been a couple people that have referenced waxed linen, and you have not mentioned that as something that you use. Is there a reason why, or is it thinner than you would want to use?
I do use it, but in a very special way. The only waxed linen I've been able to find ends up being, about 0.7. You can get it in different plies, but it's either more like thread or sort of up to 0.7 generally. And it's quite waxed. Sometimes I use slightly waxed cotton, but the waxed linen that I'm familiar with really has a lot of wax. And I use it in quite a few of my pieces, but you don't see it. I use it in the back. If there's something that I want to, knot in and never have that knot come out, you pull one of those 0.7 waxed linens, and if you do a double knot, nothing is moving ever. So that's what I use it for, sort of to lock in some things in the back, or my hanging dowel that I often put in the back. It's with that waxed linen that I do it.
There's a few people that are asking, because this is incredibly fascinating, and we don't have an image, but everybody wants to know what the back of the pieces looks like. And like, are terminated cord elements secured, finished with a fix? And I just want to put a mention in here, because one of the ways I prepped for my interview with you is that you graciously shared that if you go to YouTube and type in Al Canner in the search, there are 2 amazing videos that were produced by one of the Colorado guilds that you belong to,
Handweavers Guild of Boulder.
Handweavers Guild of Boulder, and they produced these 2 videos, and on it, he actually shows work that he has in progress. And in one of them, he turns around and sees the back. And when he showed the back of it, I was like, oh, I get it. It is worth going just to see that. And I don't remember if it was in the first or second video, but they're both worth watching, because all of this, terminates in the back. So if you want to just comment real briefly, we have another minute or 2.
Well, we're not showing you what it looks like, but early on, I decided not to try to hide anything in the back. The wall hangings, you just can't see them unless you go to look at them. And it almost seemed fraudulent or something to try to cover up with any sort of blocking thing the back. So I love that and I cut off, leave about a 1/2 inch or something of the various ends in the back. And you really do get a sense about the making by looking at the back. And the other thing that it just sort of cements for all time is that nothing was used in causing these shapes or to maintain the shapes. You can just tell by looking in the back, oh, that's actually a concave or a convex thing, and there's nothing back here but air.
Dee Landy just popped up with a question, which I was going to mention. One of the very first slides, that one with the stop start one, is yes. She said there were a few spaces between hitches that look like a row of square knots. And are they squares, or was she just seeing threads changing direction? And no, that's where you actually lashed on and did a Larks Head with a new.
Exactly. And the thing about, I'm glad the viewer saw that, because I mean, those are Lark Head's beginnings. But what was very unique for me, I mean, that's a piece for the maker.
Yes, there we go.
Yeah, because so many places here, I forced myself by the design to do what I mentioned before is the most challenging, I think, which is the start and the stop. There are scores of starts and stops, but in the places that we're just being referred to, like if you look in the dead center of the whole piece, you see the red and sort of gray coming together there, the grays going off to the right and the big red patch going off to the left. Where those are mounted, that's something I almost feel proprietary about, though I'm sure I'm not the only person who's ever stumbled into this. I actually have their double mounting of the Larks Head. There's the reds, and right underneath it is one of the grays, and they're going off in opposite directions, and it ends up really holding the piece together there because they're going off in different directions each time. So that's and I've used that in a number of pieces. The pyramids piece also relied upon that, and these two were done right after each other. Actually, I did this first, and then I think I went to the pyramids and decided, ooh, I could do a lot of things going off in different directions.
Just a subtle difference in texture. Well, I am so sad to say that we're out of time.
It went so
fast. Right, we blew through that. Thank you so much for being on Textiles and Tea. Let me just kill the questions here. It was a delight. It was a delight to meet you and do the research. And you can learn more about Al and his work on his website, cannerfiberart.com. It's up here on the thing. And his gallery of work is just exquisite. And watch those two videos. Just go to YouTube and type in Al Canner. Okay, so thank you so much to our sponsor, Tabby Tree Weaver, for sponsoring today's episode of Textiles and Tea. If you would like to, you or your guild or your shop would like to sponsor an episode of Textiles and Tea, you can learn more at weavespindye.org. And now for the shameless commercial announcements. Convergence. This is like a big deal, right? And our next one we're excited to announce is it will take place in Wichita, Kansas, July 11th through 17th, 2024. How is that possible? Please make plans to join us for this exciting fiber art conference. If you are interested in submitting a proposal to teach, even if you're new at this, they love seeing just a different point of view. If you're interested in submitting a proposal to teach, being a vendor or sponsor or volunteering, huge there, to help plan the conference, you can learn more on the website, weavespindye.org. And the leaders application portal is open. The deadline was extended to March 30th. So it's coming up. We need volunteers to help select leader proposals. Please plan we need volunteers to help select the leader proposals and to plan the conference. And if you'd like to participate, again, apply online, go to the website. And we have an event coming up. Career in Textiles is HGA's two-day online symposium spotlighting leading professional and industry trendsetters who will share their experiences and provide insights on the diverse and changing landscape of textiles and fiber art. The symposium is open to all, but it is geared towards young professionals, recent graduates, and students. Make plans to join us this Friday and Saturday. Registration is free for students and HGA members and $20 for non-members. And Textiles and Tea is supported by generous donations to the Fiber Trust. If you would like to see more programming like this, please support HGA by becoming a member or donating, or both. You can join and give on our website at weavespindye.org. Textiles and Tea is like the best thing that has come out of COVID. I look forward to it every week. If you missed part of this episode or would like to watch it again or share it with a friend, Textiles and Tea is recorded and can be viewed on HGA's Facebook page, or subscribe to our YouTube channel where you view the entire series and more. Please join Kathy next week when she shares tea, because Kathy will be back, when she shares tea with Sarah Laswell. Thank you and happy tea.